At the inheritance hearing, Dad walked in beaming, holding his pregnant mistress. My lawyer lifted an envelope. "Your Honor," he said, "the DNA results are here." And when the judge read the final line, my father's face went ghost white. I sat very still on the hard wooden bench, letting the judge's voice wash over me. He was giving instructions, reminding all parties to remain silent. But I wasn't listening. I was watching my father, Rick Hall, 3 chairs away. He was perched forward, shoulders back, radiating a smug confidence that had been honed over 60+ years of small-town respectability. He had one arm possessively draped around the young woman he now proudly called his mistress. Brenda Lee. She looked barely 30. She rested a manicured hand on her stomach, a gesture that was equal parts maternal and deeply territorial. That single, practiced touch felt like a claim on everything my mother, Margaret, had worked her entire life to build. Outside in the hallway, earlier that morning, my father had ensured everyone heard the stake he was claiming. He'd spoken loudly to Brenda Lee, his voice carrying far enough to silence the whole waiting area. "After today, sweetheart," he'd boomed, "our baby might own half this town." I hadn't answered. I simply watched him stride past me, without even a flicker of recognition. His only child, the daughter he was trying to push entirely out of the picture, was irrelevant to his performance. It was then that my lawyer, Mark Cohen, stood up. He was wearing his standard uniform, a charcoal suit, slightly rumpled, and a tie that looked vaguely like something a father would wear to a high school graduation. He lifted the plain white envelope, holding it steady and clear. "Your Honor," Mark said, "the DNA results are here." The room went instantly, powerfully still. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, the only sound accompanying the rapid thud of my own heart. I saw Brenda Lee's fingers tighten convulsively on Dad's sleeve. Dad turned toward Mark with that specific smirk I knew too well. The one that meant he was certain of his own cleverness and absolutely assured that he always landed on his feet. The judge motioned for the envelope with an impatient hand. Mark crossed the short distance to the bench, placed the envelope into the judge's waiting hand, and returned to his seat beside me. The seconds stretched into minutes as the judge slowly slid on his reading glasses, careful not to tear the paper as he unfolded it. No one else in that courtroom knew what was contained in those pages, or what was about to happen. But I did. Because I was the one who had ordered that test 3 weeks ago. It seemed a lifetime ago that my life looked fundamentally different. I was still Laura Hall, the quiet receptionist who worked the front desk at the clinic. Still living in the same small Midwestern town where I had grown up. The town had one main street, a Walmart by the highway, and significantly more churches than stop signs. Most mornings, I drove past my mother's little blue house on Maple Street, the one with the white porch and the maple tree that turned a brilliant, stunning red every single fall. Even now, months after she was gone, that house still felt intensely like hers. My mother's death had cracked my world wide open. Lung cancer took her faster than anyone expected. I spent her last months watching her shrink into her favorite recliner while the cable television murmured gently in the background. At night, I slept on the living room couch so I could be there instantly to help her to the bathroom or steady her when a fresh wave of pain hit. "Dad, however, was rarely there. He always had something essential to do: church meetings, errands, and Amon's group that took up nearly every evening. I noticed sometimes he came home smelling faintly of cheap, unfamiliar perfume. I noticed, but I simply didn't have the strength to argue or ask. I had nothing left to fight with. By the time we buried her, a new friend from his church had already appeared. He introduced Brenda Lee at the reception after the funeral. She stayed near the back pew, her hair perfectly styled, her eyes too calm for a place of mourning. When our eyes met across the crowded room, she gave me a small, practiced smile, a gesture of hollow sympathy that settled like ice in my stomach. A few weeks later, the paperwork began to arrive. Mom's official will, bank summaries, and formal notices from a probate attorney. I wasn't thinking about inheritance. I was still burning dinner, because I kept forgetting to set the timer, my brain constantly cycling through the empty rooms of the blue house. But Dad suddenly had plenty to say. "I'm sure your mother wanted to make sure I'm taken care of," he announced one evening over cold leftovers at the old kitchen table. "After all I did for her." He started talking about simplifying things, meaning selling Mom's rental duplex near the high school. Maybe even selling the house, he suggested, leaning in conspiratorially. "You don't want to be stuck with old buildings and repairs. Let me handle it. We can cash out while the market's decent." "Did Mom say she wanted that?" I asked, my voice thin. He shrugged carelessly. "We talked. You know how she worried." Once, I would have nodded and dropped the subject, accepting his authority. But a few months earlier, when Mom was first diagnosed, she had called me into her quiet bedroom. She had taken my hand and shown me the will. "I just want you to have somewhere that's yours," she had told me, her voice frail but firm. "If everything else falls apart, you will still have a roof." I remembered the exact, desperate pressure of her fingers squeezing mine when she said it. So instead of nodding now, instead of dropping the subject, I picked up one of the legal envelopes and called the number for the estate attorney, listed at the bottom. That single phone call led me directly to Mark Cohen. He let me tell the entire story without interruption. Mom's illness, Dad's absences, the new friend from church, the talk about selling everything. Then I slid a folded copy of Mom's will, the one I had quietly photographed, across his desk. He read in silence for a minute, the only sound the nervous tap of my shoe against the rug. "Your mother left the house and the rental property entirely to you," he said finally. "Your father was named executive until you reached a certain age. You are past that now. He cannot legally sell those assets without your consent." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot of worry I hadn't even realized was tied. And yet, at the same time, something tightened. "So, if he is trying to push me, you do not sign anything you do not understand," Mark stated simply. "And you do not let anyone rush you." He paused, looking at me over the rim of his glasses. "Grief and money bring out sides of people we'd rather not see." On the drive home that afternoon, the sky hung low and heavy over the fields. For the first time since my mother's funeral, I felt an emotion stronger than sadness. I felt a quiet, powerful responsibility. Over the next year, Dad transformed into a man I barely recognized. New car, new clothes, and the constant company of Brenda Lee. He started calling me his. little bleeding heart, joking at family gatherings that I was simply too soft for the real world. I smiled tightly and filed every word away. Whenever I asked about the estate papers, he brushed me off. "Why can't you just trust me?" he would say. "You are not built for this." But quietly, with Mark's calm and steady help, I began to learn exactly what I was built for. I didn't yet know that the road we were on would end in this exact courtroom. With Brenda Lee clutching her belly, a sealed envelope in my lawyer's hand, and a judge about to read words that would drain the color from my father's face. All I knew was that my mother had trusted me with the truth, and I was finally ready to fight for it. I had never been a confrontational person. My default setting, established over decades of living under my father's roof, was to smooth things over, to disappear, to make myself small and quiet. That night, after Dad talked about selling the house my mother loved, that old instinct screamed at me to simply nod, agree, and spare myself the argument. But the memory of my mother's hand squeezing mine was too strong to ignore. She had been gone for only a handful of months. But the grief still felt like a physical weight, pressing me into the worn cushions of the kitchen chair. Yet, for the first time, a sharp clarity cut through the sorrow. I realized Dad wasn't just being difficult, he was already trying to erase her. He was trying to erase the physical evidence of her life and her love. The next morning, I drove past the blue house on Maple Street. The maple tree was still mostly green, the promise of its brilliant autumn red still months away. As I looked at the white porch, I saw my mother sitting there, shelling peas, or reading, just as she had for over 30 years. I drove to the clinic, but instead of clocking in immediately, I pulled out the legal envelope. My hands were shaking, not with fear of Dad, but with the terrifying prospect of disobeying the man I had spent my entire life trying to please. I called the number listed at the bottom of the probate notice. A few days later, I was sitting across a scarred wooden desk from Mark Cohen. Mark looked exactly like the man I needed right then. Not a shark, not a flash of expensive tailoring, but a steady presence. He was wearing an ordinary blue shirt, and his thinning hair was neatly parted. Behind him sat a framed photo of 3 smiling grandchildren, and his coffee mug read, "Best Grandpa Ever." He gave off an immediate, calming sense of quiet competence. He let me talk for a long time. I explained everything: the suffocating love of my mother, the strange absences of my father, the way he smelled of different perfumes, the rapid appearance of Brenda Lee, and finally, his insistent, urgent talk of selling the duplex and the home. It felt like I was unloading a cargo of shame and confusion I had been carrying for years. "So, you feel your father is not acting in the best interest of the estate, or of you, the beneficiary," Mark summarized gently. "I feel like he's trying to push me out completely," I admitted, my voice dropping to a whisper. "He keeps saying I'm not built for this, that I should just trust him." Then, I slid the folded paper across his desk. It was the photograph I had taken of the will, the one my mother had shown me in her last days. Mark picked it up. He settled his reading glasses onto his nose and read in silence for what felt like an hour. Though it was probably only a minute. The only sound in the office was the tick of an old wall clock. His expression gave nothing away. "This document is clear, Laura," he said. using my name with a quiet authority that felt validating. Your mother, Margaret Hall, specifically bequeathed the marital home and the rental property to you. Your father, Richard Hall, was named executive only until you reached the age of 30. You are well past that age. He paused, placing the document back on the desk. He cannot legally sell those assets without your consent. The confirmation was a physical force. It felt like an enormous knot that had been wrapped around my ribs for months suddenly snapping free. I exhaled, a shaky, audible breath. So, if he's trying to rush me, if he keeps insisting, you do not sign anything you do not understand. Mark repeated, his eyes serious. And you do not let anyone rush you. As I told you, grief and money have a nasty way of bringing out sides of people we'd rather not see. Mark spent the next hour laying out a cautious, step-by-step strategy. He talked about due diligence, fiduciary duty, and probate hearings. He was not loud or aggressive. He was simply meticulous, providing a solid legal structure that stood in sharp contrast to my father's chaotic, emotional demands. We will do this calmly and correctly, Mark promised. Your mother left a legally binding document. That is the truth we will defend. I walked out of Mark's office with a heavy folder of forms and an entirely new outlook. On the drive back to the clinic, the late afternoon sun was low, casting long shadows across the fields. For the first time since Mom's death, the dominant feeling was not sadness, but responsibility. It was a heavy weight, but it was my weight. A burden of purpose rather than passive grief. I knew then that I wasn't just fighting for a house or a rental duplex. I was fighting for my mother's final act of faith in me. She had been weak and in pain, but she had been clear. She had called me into her room, not my father. She had trusted me. Mark's words about people showing their true colors quickly proved prophetic. Over the next few weeks, as I quietly stalled my father's attempts to simplify his veneer of the caring, grieving husband began to chip away. He bought a flashy, new, dark-colored car. He started taking Brenda Lee to restaurants in the next town over, places he knew people from our church wouldn't frequent. When he looked at me now, there was a new, hard edge in his eyes, impatience replacing his manufactured concern. At a distant cousin's birthday party, he put his arm around me and said, loud enough for the whole family to hear, "My daughter is just our little bleeding heart. Too soft for the real world." People chuckled uncomfortably. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation, but this time, I didn't cry. I simply smiled tightly and filed the moment away. I was quietly learning exactly what I was built for. I was built to endure his judgment. I was built to stand on the truth. Over the coming months, with Mark's guidance, I learned how to read financial statements and legal notices. I spent my evenings tracking down deeds and appraisal values. I learned to ask questions and demand answers, moving from defensive stalling to proactive strategy. I knew I couldn't beat Dad at his game of volume and performance, so I would beat him at the game of fact and law. I had no idea that my mother's simple will would lead to a courtroom confrontation involving a mistress and a sealed envelope. All I knew was that my father was trying to take what wasn't his, and I would spend every cent and every ounce of my quiet resolve to honor the last promise I made to the only person who had ever truly, unconditionally trusted me. I was past 30. I was the heir, and I was ready to claim my life. If there is one thing I have learned in small-town America, it is this: nothing spreads faster than a funeral rumor, except a rumor about money. By the time the inheritance hearing finally rolled around, nearly everyone in our town had heard some version of the story. Depending on which coffee shop you sat in, the whispers claimed that Dad was about to inherit a fortune, or that he was valiantly fighting his deadbeat daughter in court, or my favorite, that he was expecting a new baby at nearly 5 years old. I didn't correct any of it. I let people talk. They always talked anyway. My focus was elsewhere. I pulled into the courthouse parking lot early, hoping to sit in the hallway, breathe, and collect myself. I still had that old instinct, the one that told me to make myself small, quiet, and easy to overlook. Years of living around Dad will do that to you. They train you to take up as little space as possible. But as I stepped through the courthouse doors, my breath caught. Dad wasn't just here early. He had brought an audience. He didn't walk. He strutted into the lobby, wearing his favorite charcoal sport coat. His hair was slicked back, and a smile was stretched so wide it showed every capped tooth he had bought shortly after Mom died. And on his arm, clinging to him like a prom date, was Brenda Lee. She was younger than I remembered, or perhaps she simply dressed younger. She was wearing a tight sweater dress and heels that were far too high for a courthouse, and her hair was curled like she was auditioning for a soap opera. One hand rested dramatically on her stomach, as if she were posing for a maternity magazine. Dad laughed too loudly at something she whispered, then looked around to make sure people noticed them. When his eyes landed on me, they didn't soften, not even a flicker of recognition for his own child. Just that polished, smug smile I despised. "Well, if it isn't my daughter," he said, speaking as if he were greeting a distant, unremarkable cousin. "You are early. That's surprising." Brenda Lee giggled and pressed herself closer to him. "Hi, sweetheart," she said to me, her tone dripping with manufactured, sugary condescension. "We've heard so much about you." I didn't answer. Mark had coached me repeatedly, do not take the bait. But Dad didn't need me to react. He wanted an audience, and the courthouse hallway delivered one. Every bench, every chair, was lined with people waiting for their own cases. All of them, now, were watching us. Dad thrived on that attention. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said loudly, patting Brenda Lee's belly, as if he were presenting a grand prize on a game show. "Just when life seems to be winding down, He gives you something to live for." Brenda Lee placed a hand over her heart and looked up at him lovingly. "Our little miracle," she breathed. My throat burned with something hot and sharp, caught between anger and embarrassment. Not because of the baby, if it was even real, but because it was so painfully clear what he was doing. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted the whole town to see him as a revitalized man with a new family, while I stood alone, armed only with my quiet folders and my dignity. He leaned toward the couple sitting beside us, total strangers, and said with theatrical sadness, "My daughter hasn't been supportive. Of course, some people don't like sharing." The strangers looked profoundly uncomfortable. I felt myself swallow a small, acrid lump of shame I didn't deserve. Mark arrived just then, briefcase in hand, cutting through the tension. He nodded politely at Dad, who puffed his chest out like a bantam rooster. "Morning, everyone," Mark said calmly, his voice steady. "Isn't it a beautiful day?" Dad snorted. "Beautiful for some." Brenda Lee tightened her grip on his arm, sensing the shift in momentum. "It will be a very big day for our baby," she said, her voice high. "Generational wealth changes everything." She delivered the line like a quote she had practiced in the mirror. I stiffened, feeling the sting of the blatant greed. Dad noticed my reaction. "Oh, did you not know?" he said, his voice booming through the hallway. "My child, my future child, has just as much claim as you do. That's how real families work." A few heads turned. Someone whispered. I felt the sharp, familiar humiliation from my childhood. The feeling that he could always make me feel small, with just a single sentence or a glance. But this time, something was different. His cruelty didn't land the way it used to. Maybe because I wasn't a scared teenager anymore. Maybe because my mother's signature on her will was burned into my memory. Or maybe it was because I knew what my lawyer had sealed in that plain white envelope tucked into his briefcase. Brenda Lee took a deliberate step closer and lowered her voice so only Dad, Mark, and I could hear. "Don't take it too hard," she whispered. Her smile sickly sweet. "Some women just aren't meant to be heirs or mothers." Dad chuckled, delighted by her nastiness. Mark shot her a sharp, disapproving look. "Classy," he murmured, loud enough that she registered the judgment. Before she could respond, a bailiff opened the courtroom door. "Estate of Margaret Hall," he called. "Please step inside." Dad inhaled deeply and squeezed Brenda Lee's waist. "Showtime," he said. As we walked into the courtroom together, yet utterly apart, I felt the old ache of family rupture, the kind that never fully heals. The wooden pews, the solemn seal above the judge's bench, the stale government air. It all felt too holy a place for the cheap performance Dad was putting on. We took our seats. The judge entered. Dad straightened proudly, beaming like a man about to collect a lottery check. And that's when I knew with quiet, profound certainty, that the truth sitting in Mark's briefcase, the truth Dad didn't know was coming, would hit him harder than anything I could ever say. For once in my life, I didn't feel small. I felt ready. My emotional arc had shifted from quiet avoidance to a powerful, steel-backed resolve. When the judge finally settled into his high leather seat, the entire courtroom shifted into that heavy, disciplined silence you only feel in government buildings or the most solemn churches. It was the kind of hush where every cough echoes and every whisper feels like an immediate sin. Dad loved it. He sat tall, chin lifted, his hand resting possessively on Brenda Lee's knee, as if presenting her to the judge as Exhibit A, proof that he deserved everything. I kept my eyes forward, my hands folded neatly on the table. Beside me, I could feel Mark's calm, steady presence. He wasn't loud or flashy, just composed, like the old oak trees that line our main street. The judge spent a moment flipping through the thick case file, pausing to skim key pages. "This is a continuation of the estate matter regarding the late Margaret Hall," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of the state. "Today's goal is to clarify asset distribution and address objections raised by Mr. Hall." Dad gave a theatrical sigh, the kind only someone deeply committed to his own performance could pull off. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, injecting his voice with what he hoped sounded like deep grief. I'm here to make sure my late wife's wishes are honored. I almost laughed out loud. Mark, however, remained impassive. He simply adjusted his reading glasses, the way he always did, before letting someone talk themselves right into trouble. The judge turned directly to Dad. Your filings claim that certain assets, specifically the marital home and the rental duplex, should revert to you rather than transfer to your daughter, Ms. Hall. Is that correct? That is correct. Dad confirmed, giving a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. My wife always believed in keeping the family secure. She said many times she wanted me in control of things. And the will? The judge asked mildly. Dad shrugged, treating the will as if it were inconvenient paperwork. My wife was very sick, Your Honor. You know how pain affects clarity. I believe she meant something different from what was written down. I stiffened. That lie. That suggestion that my mother was somehow confused or incompetent felt like a direct assault on her memory. I wanted to leap up and shout, but Mark placed a steady, subtle hand on my forearm, a silent reminder to stay composed. Brenda Lee leaned forward, making sure her low-cut sweater provided a strategic distraction. She whispered loudly enough for the courtroom microphones to pick it up. Besides, Your Honor, there is a baby now. Family grows, priorities shift. Dad nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. My unborn child deserves protection, too. The judge raised one eyebrow slightly, a tiny but effective signal of his skepticism. We will address that claim in due time, Mr. Hall. Dad beamed, mistaking the judge's patience for agreement. Mark cleared his throat, rising to his feet with unhurried dignity. Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to enter into the record that the will was prepared by a licensed attorney and signed independently by Mrs. Hall while she was mentally competent. I have the medical assessments from her oncologist to confirm her full capacity at the time. He handed several folders to the bailiff. The judge skimmed the documents, nodding slowly. This appears in order. Dad's jaw tightened, a small crack forming in his confident demeanor. But arrogance is a stubborn, resilient thing. It refuses to yield easily. He leaned forward again, elbows on the table, shifting his attack. My daughter has had a difficult life, he said, his tone dripping with false concern. She's fragile, easily influenced. I worry the responsibility of managing property will overwhelm her. My guidance would honor her mother's intent. Fragile. The word hit me like a small pebble, not a stone. It was irritating, almost laughable now. He used the word to make himself seem large. But all it did was remind me of how small he had always tried to make me feel. I was the one who nursed my mother. I was the one who called the lawyer. I was not fragile. Mark responded gently, calmly. Your Honor, my client, Miss Hall, has maintained steady employment, paid her own bills responsibly, and dealt capably with multiple complex legal documents over the past 2 years. She is neither fragile nor incapable. The issue here is simply respecting the written will. The judge nodded again. That small act of agreement was enough to make Dad push harder, desperation beginning to bleed into his performance. My wife always said our daughter wasn't prepared for the real world. He insisted. She struggled in school, had trouble making friends, never stuck with anything. I tried my best to raise her, but enough, the judge said firmly, cutting him off mid-sentence. Dad blinked, startled. The courtroom held its breath. This is a probate hearing, not a personal character evaluation. We are here to interpret the will and determine legality. Unless you can provide written evidence that your wife's stated wishes changed, we move forward with the document as signed. Dad opened his mouth, closed it, then tried one last angle. Well, Your Honor, he said, gesturing toward Brenda Lee's stomach. The real issue is fairness. If my daughter takes everything, that leaves nothing for my next child. A child who deserves their birthright. Brenda Lee lifted her chin, playing her role perfectly, radiating aggrieved motherhood. I waited. Mark waited. We both knew what was coming later, but letting Dad dig his own hole, sentence by sentence, was a strange, quiet kind of satisfaction. It was steady, inevitable revenge. The judge folded his hands, studying the pair. At this point, the unborn child's rights depend entirely on paternity, an applicable state law. This claim has been vigorously disputed by the petitioner, Ms. Hall. Brenda Lee piped up, her voice sharp. There's no dispute. He's the father. He's always been the father. Mark finally spoke, his voice calm as a still lake. Your Honor, we will address the paternity matter shortly. Dad glared at Mark, then shot a look of pure hatred at me, as if I had somehow conjured the universe out of sheer spite. The emotional beat of the scene had shifted from my personal humiliation to a growing office quiet, steady revenge. If I was simply allowing his arrogance to build his own trap. He was about to learn that my quiet reserve was not fragility. It was strategy. The judge's sharp command for Dad to stop the personal attacks was the first visible crack in my father's armor. He had entered the courtroom, expecting a friendly chat with an authority figure, not a legal dissection of his character. But arrogance, I had learned, makes one completely blind to details. Dad quickly shifted his energy back to his primary claim, the needs of his next child. Well, Your Honor, Dad insisted, trying to recapture his smooth, paternal persona. The ultimate issue here is still the baby. We need to plan for my child's future. Mark leaned toward the judge. Your Honor, we will address the paternity matter shortly. But first, we need to address the matter of financial management. During the period Mr. Hall acted as executive. Dad glared at Mark, then at me. His smooth smile was now a tight, resentful line. The judge turned pages in his file. Mr. Hall, there also appears to be an issue with financial management. Several accounts show large withdrawals, under your signature with funds unaccounted for. You were executive at the time. Dad looked genuinely stunned, as if the legal system had somehow violated the unwritten rules of his performance. This wasn't supposed to be part of the show. Those were normal expenses, he said quickly, his voice slightly higher than before. Home repairs, bills. A man can't be expected to remember every detail. Mark stood, unhurried and patient. He did not look at Dad. He simply slid a thin, neatly organized folder onto the table. Your Honor, Mark stated, his voice calm and factual. We have itemized statements and contractor testimony indicating no such repairs occurred in the house or the duplex. Additionally, multiple withdrawals coincide exactly with of state recreational charges. Brenda Lee stiffened beside Dad, her hand involuntarily dropping from his sleeve. Dad shot her a swift, warning look, a look of pure, cold fury that was far more genuine than any of the sadness he had put on for the judge. I watched silently. This was the man who raised me. The man who scoffed at my school awards and warned me not to get a big head. The man who bought new furniture for himself when mom needed money for chemo. He had spent years perfecting the role of the devoted, aggrieved father, but the mask was dissolving rapidly now. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, looking tired. This case is quickly becoming more complicated than a simple will review. Mr. Hall, you were legally obligated to act in the best interest of the estate and its beneficiaries. Mr. Cohen's filings suggest a serious breach of fiduciary duty. Dad stammered, scrambling to recover. I didn't know it wasn't clear. Lawyers make this stuff too complicated. Mark continued gently, as if guiding a struggling student through a lesson. Your Honor. This pattern continues for several months. Large withdrawals of $3,000, then $5,000, then $7,000, all coinciding with out-of-state trips and hotel charges. All using estate funds during the period when Mr. Hall acted as executive. He slid a final document across the table. Your Honor, please note Exhibit F, Mr. Hall's credit card statements. On the exact same days as these alleged house repairs, multiple charges were made at Silver Star Casino in Wisconsin. A wave of soft, communal gasps rippled through the courtroom pews. It was the sound of a small town realizing a truth that was uglier and lonelier than any rumor. Dad shot up from his seat, his chair scraping loudly on the wood floor. This is out of context, he yelled, his voice laced with panic. I'm allowed to have a little fun. My wife had died. How dare you judge how I coped? The judge tapped his gavel lightly. Sit down, Mr. Hall. Dad sank back into his seat. His face flushed a deep, unhealthy red. Brenda Lee inched farther away, her dramatic composure completely gone. I looked down at my hands. My palms were damp. Yes, the DNA revelation, still to come, would be the big shock. But this, the exposure of his selfish recklessness. This was the part that truly broke something inside him. This was the moment his pride turned into shame. Your Honor, Mark concluded, we also have records indicating Mr. Hall had already accepted a low market, cash, only offer for the rental duplex from an associate, without Ms. Hall's consent or knowledge. He was attempting to liquidate assets illegally. I needed money, Dad shouted, jabbing a finger toward me. All right? Is that what you want to hear? I was drowning. Or Mr. Hall, this is deeply concerning, the judge said, his tone turning severe. Given the misuse of estate funds, the attempt to sell property without authority, and the misleading statements you have made in this courtroom, I am considering sanctions. Dad sagged. For the first time, he didn't look older, he just looked old. The way a man looks when he realizes he can't bluff his way out of a hole he dug himself. He whispered, his voice cracking. I just needed a chance. Life hasn't been fair to me. The mistress, Brenda Lee, rolled her eyes subtly. This case is too volatile to proceed without confirmation of the paternity claim, the judge declared. We will take a short recess before proceeding with the final paternity questions. Dad rose confidently, as if he still believed he could spin this. He smoothed his jacket and escorted Brenda Lee toward the hallway with the last shreds of his swagger. But as they walked away, I saw it again, the shift in his eyes. He was rattled. He was afraid. We hadn't even opened the envelope yet, but the quiet, relentless truth was catching up to him like a slow, cold tide, and for the first time in my life, my father looked small. The emotional beat of the scene was a tangible sense of fear beginning to take over arrogance. His total public and private collapse was now inevitable. The courtroom hummed with nervous, low-pitched whispers as the bailiff called for recess. Dad rose like a man preparing for a parade instead of an inquest. He straightened his jacket, smoothed his thinning hair, and escorted Brenda Lee toward the hallway with the last desperate vestiges of his swagger. She clung to him, smiling brightly, whispering little reassurances he seemed frantic to believe. Mark and I stayed in our seats. The energy was electric, charged with the anticipation of what was coming next. "He's rattled," Mark said, leaning closer and lowering his voice. "You just can't see it yet, but he is searching for a foothold." I slowly exhaled. My hands, resting on the table, felt oddly cool and steady. "He still thinks he has control," I murmured. Mark nodded. "Arrogance is predictable. It always forgets to look behind itself." We sat quietly for a moment. I thought about my mother, Margaret. The way she had squeezed my hand the day she showed me her will. How her voice cracked when she whispered that she didn't trust Dad to handle the estate alone. She had asked, "Promise me you will stand up for yourself when the time comes." I had promised. But I never imagined the moment of reckoning would look like this: a silent courtroom, a pregnant mistress, and a secret envelope. "Ready?" Mark asked, his voice snapping me back to the present. I nodded. "Good. Then let's finish this." When the judge returned, his expression was composed but sterner than before. The courtroom filled again quickly. Dad with a visibly manufactured confidence, Brenda Lee with her practiced gentle smile, and a few more curious bystanders who sensed that the juicy part was finally here. "All right," the judge said, settling in. "Before we continue the financial matters, we need to address the paternity claim presented by Mr. Hall." Brenda Lee lifted her chin proudly. Dad squeezed her hand, a gesture of ownership. Mark rose. "Your Honor," he said, "as indicated earlier, my client has submitted documentation relevant to this matter. With the court's permission, we would like to present it now." The judge motioned with his hand. "Proceed." Mark reached into his briefcase and withdrew the envelope. It was plain white, unassuming, and he held it up for just a moment, a simple relic holding immense power. Dad laughed. He actually laughed, a dry, incredulous sound that bordered on a shriek. "Oh, come on," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "What is this? Some stunt? A test my daughter ordered because she's jealous of our new family?" Brenda Lee stroked her stomach and whispered loudly, "This is harassment, Your Honor." Mark remained perfectly unbothered. "Your Honor, these are accredited laboratory results from a legally obtained paternity test. They were secured through the proper chain of custody, following judicial guidelines." The judge held out his hand. "Bring it here." Dad leaned back in his chair, smirking one last time. "Go on then. Let's get this over with." Mark walked the envelope to the bench and placed it gently in the judge's palm. A profound hush fell over the courtroom. I could feel my heartbeat, a frantic, heavy rhythm echoing in my ears. The judge tore the seal, took out the papers, and unfolded them. He read the first section, then the second. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that the courtroom air seemed to tighten, growing heavy and thick. Dad's smirk began to waver, shrinking into a frown of uncertainty. "Your Honor," he prompted. The judge looked up, fixing his gaze on Brenda Lee first, then on Dad. He spoke slowly, deliberately. "These test results," he said, "indicate a 0% probability of paternity." Silence. Brenda Lee blinked once. Dad frowned, utterly confused. "What does that mean?" the judge repeated, enunciating each word with cold clarity. "Mr. Hall is not the father of this child." Brenda Lee's face drained instantly of all color. It was as if someone had flicked a switch, turning the light out behind her eyes. Dad turned to her slowly, stiffly, like an old hinge resisting movement. "What is he talking about?" She opened her mouth, closed it, and then burst into tears. Loud, dramatic sobs that echoed off the high wooden pews, the last, desperate act of her performance. "It's wrong," she cried. "It has to be wrong. Those things aren't accurate. They mix up samples all the time." "They don't," Mark said gently, but firmly. "Not when chain of custody is properly documented and verified." Dad shot to his feet, his chair nearly toppling over. "You're lying! All of you! This is a setup, a conspiracy. My daughter has been out to destroy me for years." I stayed seated, calm. Dad's fury, so familiar and predictable, simply washed over me like background noise. "Your Honor," Mark said smoothly, addressing the judge while Dad ranted. "We would also like to submit Exhibit C in security footage from the laboratory on the day of the test, confirming both Ms. Lee's presence and the identity verification required before samples were taken." People in the pews turned to look at Brenda Lee. Dad stared at her with a stiff, twitching jaw. "You tell them the truth?" he hissed. "Tell them this baby is mine." Her sobs quieted suddenly. She looked at him with a strange, bitter mixture of guilt and resentment. "You don't know what it's been like," she whispered, her voice husky. "He said he would take care of me. You made promises too." "Hey!" Dad shrieked. "Who is he?" She didn't answer. But she didn't have to. The truth hung heavy in the air. Mark leaned toward me. "This is where arrogance finally sees itself," he murmured. The judge cleared his throat, tapping his gavel once. "Given this new evidence, the unborn child has no legal standing in this estate matter. Paternity fraud is a serious allegation, and the court will not entertain any further claims regarding this pregnancy." Dad slumped back into his seat, as though every bone in his body had suddenly collapsed. He was gasping, chest heaving. Brenda Lee looked away, avoiding his gaze. And then, for the first time since I had walked into the courthouse that morning, Dad's eyes met mine. They were not filled with power, or contempt, or the usual smug superiority. They were filled with something raw and utterly unfamiliar panic. The judge stacked the papers neatly and set them aside. "We will now continue with the inheritance proceedings," he said. "But first, Mr. Hall," he paused. "You will need to compose yourself." Dad inhaled sharply, his chest trembling violently. The proud, strutting man who had filled the hallway with his performance an hour ago was gone, replaced by someone smaller, older, and stripped bare. And all I felt was a quiet sadness. Not triumph, not revenge, just the truth settling into place the way truth always does, heavily, inevitably, without apology. The emotional beat of the scene had culminated in a realization of inevitability and profound relief. The war was over, even if the trial continued. Dad didn't look like himself anymore. The confident man, who had strutted into the courthouse, with a mistress wrapped around his arm, had simply evaporated. What sat before me now was someone smaller, someone shaken. Someone who kept blinking, as if he couldn't quite believe the world had tilted completely under his feet. But the day wasn't done with him yet. The judge waited patiently for the murmurs in the courtroom to settle. "We will now resume the matter of estate distribution," he said. "But given the previous executive's conduct, we must address irregularities in the financial records." Dad stiffened. His fingers trembled as they clutched the edge of the table. Brenda Lee sat rigidly beside him, mascara streaking down her cheeks. But she still managed to lean subtly away from him, as though his disgrace might be contagious. Mark stood, his movements unhurried, emphasizing the methodical nature of the law against the chaos of my father's lies. "Your Honor, as we outlined in our filings, the financial documentation raises serious concerns. I'd like to walk the court through a few examples." He opened a thick, immaculate binder. His pages were crisp and neatly tabbed. Dad's copies of those same statements, I knew, had shown up crumpled, coffee-stained, and suspiciously incomplete. Mark began with the first withdrawal. 2 months after Mrs. Hall's passing, he said, "Mr. Hall withdrew $10,000 from the joint estate account." Dad swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "House repairs," he muttered quickly, though no one had asked him yet. Mark raised a patient eyebrow. "We contacted every major contractor in the county. No work orders, no estimates. No home visits corresponding to this amount." He then flipped to another tab. "And this second withdrawal? $12,000 a few weeks later." Dad's lips tightened into a thin, white line. "More house repairs. And the next one. Garage repairs. And the next one. Roof repairs." Mark paused, letting the silence hold the weight of the absurdity. "Interesting," he said. "Because the home inspector who evaluated the property just 8 months ago stated that the house hadn't seen recent repairs of any kind. In fact, he noted long-term neglect." The judge leaned forward, his patience clearly exhausted. "Mr. Hall, do you have documentation for any of these repair expenses?" Dad rubbed his forehead furiously. "I didn't keep them. Not everyone keeps receipts." Mark slid a printed email onto the table. "Your Honor, please note Exhibit F, Mr. Hall's credit card statements. On the same days as these alleged repairs, charges were made as Silver Star Casino in Wisconsin Das." A wave of soft gasps rippled through the gallery once more. This was not about paternity drama. This was about cold, hard theft and selfish, reckless betrayal. Dad shot up from his seat again.
"This is out of context,"
he yelled, his voice rough and uneven. "I'm allowed to have a little fun. I was grieving." "How dare you judge how I coped?" The judge tapped his gavel firmly. "Sit down." Dad sank into his seat, face flushed. Brenda Lee inched further away, betraying her final alliance. Mark continued gently, almost sadly. "Your Honor, this pattern continues for several months. Large withdrawals coinciding precisely with out-of-state casino trips, recreational spending, and hotel charges. All using estate funds during the period when Mr. Hall acted as executive." Dad tried to speak, but his voice came out hoarse and strained. "I didn't know, it wasn't clear." "Lawyers make this stuff too complicated. The law is very clear," the judge said sharply. "An executive is legally obligated to act in the best interest of the estate and its beneficiaries. Misuse of estate funds is a breach of fiduciary duty. I looked down at my hands, my palms suddenly slick. The DNA revelation had rattled him. But this was the part that truly broke him. For years, he had built his entire life on pride and a cultivated image. The respectable church man, the devoted husband who had suffered for a difficult wife. The father burdened with a daughter who never made things easy. Now the mask was completely gone, and the truth underneath was not grand or dramatic. It was lonely, selfish, and desperate. Mark turned a final page. And then there is the matter of the rental property. Mr. Hall attempted to sell it without my client's consent or knowledge. It was falling apart. Dad shouted. I was trying to save her from a financial disaster. Mark did not even look at Dad. Odd, he said. Because the appraisal we obtained last spring valued the property at nearly $200,000, and records show Mistress Hall had already accepted a below-market, cash-only offer from an associate who owns multiple rental units near the high school. Dad slammed his fist on the table. I needed money! All right. Is that what you want to hear? I was drowning, and he jabbed a furious, trembling finger toward me, was too selfish to help. Something in me went utterly still. Too selfish to help. After I had spent the last months of my mother's life, sleeping on a couch beside her bed. After I had spent a year trying to honor the will she had shown me with trembling hands. After I had endured his cruelty and his neglect. He still saw me only as a selfish obstacle to his needs. The judge exhaled slowly. Mr. Hall, this is deeply concerning. Given the misuse of estate funds, the attempt to sell property without authority, and the misleading statements you have made in this courtroom, I am considering imposing severe sanctions. Dad sagged in his seat. For the first time, the word old finally fit him. He looked like a man who realized he had run out of bluffs. He said quietly, his voice a broken whisper. I just needed a chance. Life hasn't been fair to me. Mark closed his binder. Your Honor, we believe that at this point the safe and lawful path is to remove Mr. Hall entirely from any remaining estate roles and proceed with full transfer to my client, Miss Hall, as the will dictates. The judge nodded slowly. I agree. Dad let out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. And strangely, my heart hurt for him. Not because he deserved sympathy, but because reality was catching up to him, like a slow, cold tide, and he was completely unequipped to face it. This was not my triumph. This was heartbreak in slow motion. The emotional beat of the scene had culminated in a deep sense of sorrowful justice. The judge let the silence stretch. One of those deep courtroom silences that makes you feel like even the walls are holding their breath. Dad stared at the table as though the wood grain might offer him some impossible escape route. Brenda Lee, now visibly irritated, dabbed at her smeared mascara, but didn't look at him, not once. I sat still, my hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. Revenge doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like the quiet, inevitable settling of truth. The judge finally spoke. Mr. Hall, I have reviewed the will, the financial documents, and the evidence presented today. It is abundantly clear that your late wife intended her assets to go to her daughter. It is also clear you have repeatedly acted against that intent. Dad opened his mouth, but the judge lifted a hand. You mismanaged funds, attempted unauthorized sales, and misled this court. You also introduced a paternity claim that has now proven fraudulent. Brenda Lee flinched at the word, fraudulent. Dad pressed a hand to his forehead, as though blindsided. The judge continued, his voice steady but unyielding. Therefore, I am removing you from any involvement in this estate. You will repay the mismanaged amount, as determined by the forensic accountant assigned to this case, and going forward, you are barred from making further claims against the estate. Dad's shoulders slumped, as if someone had placed a heavy coat made of bricks across his back. This is absurd, he whispered. You are punishing me. Everything I did for my family. The judge's tone softened only slightly. Family is not defined by control, Mr. Hall. Nor by intimidation, nor by deceit. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Those quiet communal sounds that come when people witness something painfully human. I felt a tightness in my throat. Then the judge turned to me. Ms. Hall, the estate will now transfer fully to you. I trust you will honor your mother's wishes responsibly. I nodded, unable to speak past the sudden swell of emotion. The relief wasn't triumphant. It was gentle, like finally putting down a heavy box I had carried too far. Court is adjourned, the judge said. The gavel struck the wood, sharp and final. Dad didn't move. Brenda Lee, however, moved quickly. She stood, gathered her purse, and walked right past him. No goodbye, no explanation. Just a stiff exit in her high heels. A woman whose performance had ended the minute the spotlight dimmed. Dad didn't seem to notice she was gone. He just sat there, hands trembling, staring at nothing. Mark packed his briefcase slowly. This was a long time coming, he said softly. Your mother would be proud. Proud. The word hit me in a place I didn't know was still raw. Thank you. I managed. He nodded and left to handle paperwork, leaving me for the first time truly alone with my father. Dad finally lifted his gaze. His eyes looked puffy, unfocused, the way a man looks after losing a long, bitter fight he thought he would win by default. You're happy now, he said hoarsely. The accusation wasn't sharp, it was tired, almost childlike. No, I said quietly. I'm not happy. Then what do you want from me? His voice cracked. You have taken everything. I didn't take anything, I said. Mom left it to me. I'm just honoring that. He rubbed his temples. She always favored you. Always. Dad. I said softly, the truth coming without bitterness. She favored whoever showed up. I just happened to be there. He flinched. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The courtroom was nearly empty now. You could have told me you were struggling, I said. With the money, with everything. He laughed bitterly. And look weak in front of my own daughter. You already did, I said. Just not in the ways you think. He looked at me, then really looked. It was the first time in years he had seen me, not as an extension of his ego, or a reminder of my mother, but as a person, a grown woman. He opened his mouth again, but words didn't come. Instead, his face crumpled, not dramatically, but in a quiet, devastating way. He looked smaller somehow, like time had finally caught him. Take it all, he whispered. The house, the money, all of it. You have won. It wasn't about winning. I shook my head gently. He didn't believe me. Maybe he never would. He walked toward the double doors, shoulders slumped, steps uneven. As he reached the threshold, he paused and looked back. I loved your mother, he said. I just never knew how to love her the way she deserved. Or you. Then he left, not triumphant, not angry, just hollow. And as the doors swung shut behind him, I realized something with surprising clarity. This revenge wasn't a victory, it was a release. A release from years of wondering if I deserved better. A release from carrying his failures as if they were my own. In the weeks after the hearing, I moved into Mom's blue house on Maple Street. I unpacked my things. I painted the kitchen cabinets and fixed the wobbly porch step. One cool afternoon, raking leaves under the maple tree, I realized the feeling in my chest wasn't triumph. It was safety. Then, an envelope arrived with his shaky handwriting on it. At the kitchen table, where Mom used to drink her coffee, I opened it. The letter was short. He didn't mention the hearing or the money. He wrote, I have told myself for years that I was the one who got cheated. The truth is I failed your mother, and I failed you. Not because you were ungrateful, but because I was too proud to admit I needed help. I see that now. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just don't want to leave this world without saying I know what I did. At the bottom was the name and address of an assisted living facility in the next town. A week later, on a gray Saturday, I drove there. He sat in a recliner by the window, thinner and grayer. On the nightstand sat an old picture of me as a kid grinning. You came, he said. I read your letter, I replied. We talked for a while. Not about the will or the mistress, but about my mother and how scared he had been when she got sick. He didn't excuse himself. He just admitted it. I can't give you the father you should have had, he said, eyes wet. All I can say is I know it now. And I'm sorry I made you fight so hard for what should have been yours all along. I took a slow breath. I won't forget, I said. And I won't pretend it didn't matter. But I'm tired, too. Tired of carrying this. So, I accept your apology and I forgive you. Not because you earned it, but because I don't want this to own the rest of my life. He let out a long breath, like air slowly escaping from a tire. Thank you, he whispered. When he died months later, it was a simple phone call. I hung up, walked out to the porch, and looked at the maple tree. For the first time, I felt grief for my father, without anger tangled in it. Just sadness for a man who had spent most of his life running from himself. Justice gave me closure. Forgiveness gave me rest.